Welcome to Stuff They Didn't Teach Me in Sunday School. In the last episode of Stuff They Didn't Teach Me in Sunday School, we left Jesus dead on the cross. I don't like to leave him there because we know that's not the end of the story. Luke doesn't leave him there either. Luke continues the story, and he continues to look at the resurrection accounts from his own unique Luke point of view, probably told to him by Mary and by Peter. The first thing we're told by Luke, that we're not told by other gospel writers, is that we are told that he was buried by Joseph of Arimathea in his own tomb. What we're not told is that he was a member of the council who had not consented to their purpose or deed. In other words, he's part of the Sanhedrin that held the nighttime trial, the illegal trial, and found Jesus guilty and then hauled him off to Pilate to be crucified. But Luke adds the line that he wasn't consenting to that, Joseph of Arimathea, who gives up his tomb. Always wondered where Nicodemus and Joseph were that night. Apparently not at the council, or else they spoke out and that's not recorded anywhere. But both were part of that council that found Jesus guilty of blasphemy and took him to Pilate. The resurrection account in Luke's gospel is predictably to women. The women go out to the tomb. In all the gospel accounts they do. But here they're named. In verse 10 of chapter 24, it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary, the mother of James, and other women with them. They went out. They are told that Jesus isn't there. There's no appearance in Luke's gospel, no appearance to them in Luke's gospel. And they go and tell the disciples. Now, the interesting thing, and Luke would have known this, was that the testimony of women was not to be believed in court. They wasn't allowed in court, in a Jewish court. Only men's testimony was allowed. Women were not thought to be trustworthy. Sorry, ladies, but that was the way it was back in those days. We know that's not true today. But the last line here in verse 11 of chapter 24, but these words seemed to them, to the apostles, when the women came and told them, an idle tale, and they did not believe them. And that's why. The women's testimony was not to be trusted. The next story in Luke's gospel is unique to Luke, and it's two disciples walking on the way to Emmaus. Emmaus is not far from Jerusalem, about 7 miles away, and they're walking to Jerusalem and talking to each other about what's going on, probably in fear, probably in confusion, because remember, they don't realize that Jesus is going to suffer and die, and they don't expect him to be alive again. And while they're talking, you know the story, Jesus appears with them. He begins to tell them about what happened with Jesus, was really fulfilling what happened in the Old Testament. And as he opens up the scriptures to them, they begin to understand a little. And then when he sits with them, and interestingly enough, when he breaks the bread, they recognize who he is, and he disappears. So the appearance, the first appearance of Jesus after his resurrection in Luke's gospel is to these two men on the way to Emmaus. I think you can probably see some sacramental kinds of things in that breaking of bread, that Jesus appears to them in the breaking of bread, and he appears to you and me, comes to us personally in the bread and the wine of the Lord's Supper. Their eyes were opened, it says in verse 31. They recognized him, and he vanished out of their sight. And they said to each other, did not our hearts burn within us while he talked to us on the road, while he opened to us the scriptures? He helped them to see himself in the Old Testament. He helped them to begin to understand, at least begin to understand, what was going on with his suffering and death and resurrection. In verse 44, he appears to the disciples again, and he says there, these are my words which I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled. Matthew is the writer that tells you this event happened to fulfill this passage in the Old Testament. But Luke makes sure that before he's through with his work, he lets you know that what Jesus is and who he is and what he did was all talked about by Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms in the Old Testament. The last story in Luke's gospel is a very quick story, about 3 verses, about the ascension. And ironically, or interestingly, the first story in Luke volume 2, which we call Acts, is the ascension. So the ascension is that bridge between his two works. And as Luke defends the Christian faith before Theophilus, the person to whom he writes this book, he does so by showing Theophilus that Jesus is not a revolutionary in the sense of wanting to overthrow the Roman government, but he is a compassionate, caring Messiah, not just for the men of Israel, but for the women and for Gentiles as well. A compassionate Christ who lives and reigns to eternity.